The sweat had begun to pool beneath his collar, cold and viscous against his skin. Captain Dmitri Volkov sat rigidly in the wooden chair, his hands clasped on the scarred table before him, fingers interlaced to stop them from trembling. The interrogation room was smaller than he'd imagined, barely 3 meters across, with walls the color of old bone and a single incandescent bulb swaying almost imperceptibly overhead. Each creak of the light fixture seemed to count down the seconds until his unraveling. Across from him, 2 NKVD officers studied him with the patience of men who already knew the answer to every question they would ask. Major Korsakov, the older one, had eyes like ice chips, colorless, reflective, revealing nothing. His younger colleague, Lieutenant Surikov, drummed his fingers on a manila folder that Volkov knew contained his fate. The rhythm was maddening. Tap, 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 like a judge's gavel in slow motion. "Tell us again about the night of October 17th, Korsakov said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You were assigned to infiltration detail. 3rd Ukrainian Front, the manor house outside Poltava." Volkov swallowed. His throat clicked audibly in the silence. "Yes, Comrade Major. I was part of reconnaissance team Volk 7. Our objective was intelligence gathering on German divisional command structure." "Intelligence gathering?" Surikov interrupted, not looking up from his notes. "Is that what you call it?" The question hung in the air like poison gas. Volkov felt his pulse accelerate, a drumbeat against his temples. Through the door, he could hear voices in the corridor, low, conspiratorial murmurs. Someone laughed, the sound cutting off abruptly. Were they reading the reports right now? The testimonies? Were they holding the silk cord in gloved hands, examining it under harsh light, cataloging the pattern of bruises it had left on flesh? "I followed my orders," Volkov said carefully, each word measured and placed like a chess piece. The mission parameters were clearly defined. Korsakov leaned back in his chair, which groaned under his weight. "And did those parameters include the murder of an unarmed German officer? Behind closed doors? While dressed as a servant?" The word murder landed like a physical blow. Volkov's jaw tightened. Outside the room, more footsteps, heavier this time. Deliberate. Military boots on concrete. Coming closer, he forced himself to breathe evenly, to keep his expression neutral, even as his mind screamed warnings. They were building a case. Assassination of a high-value target could be framed as heroism or as a war crime, depending on who controlled the narrative. And right now, in this gray room with these gray men, the narrative was being written in real time. "He was an enemy combatant," Volkov said, his voice steadier than he felt. Colonel Ernst Hoffmann commanded the 44th Infantry Division. His strategic planning had resulted in the deaths of thousands of Soviet soldiers. His elimination was a legitimate military objective. Legitimate. Surikov finally looked up, his young face carrying an expression of practiced skepticism. "Tell me, Captain, when you wrapped that cord around his neck, when you pulled it tight while he thrashed beneath you, when you watched the life drain from his eyes, did it feel legitimate then?" The detail made Volkov's stomach turn. They knew everything. Someone had talked one of the partisan contacts, perhaps, or someone from his own unit. In this war, in this service, loyalty was a commodity that could be traded when the price was high enough. "I felt nothing," Volkov lied, the words bitter as ash. "I completed my mission." But that was the problem, wasn't it? He had felt something. In that chandelier-lit study, with classical music drifting up from the ballroom below, with his fingers locked around the silk cord and Hoffman's champagne-scented breath growing shallow and desperate, he had felt alive. Powerful, like an instrument of divine retribution. And they could see it in him now, these men who specialized in reading guilt in the micro-movements of facial muscles, the dilation of pupils, the quickening of breath. The door opened suddenly. A uniformed woman entered, carrying a cardboard box that she placed on the table with deliberate care. Volkov's eyes tracked to it involuntarily. He knew what was inside before Korsakov even opened it. The silk cord, stained dark at both ends where his hands had gripped it. Elegant, ancient, deadly. "Tell us about the cord, Captain," Korsakov said softly. Where does a Soviet soldier learn to kill with a weapon that predates firearms by centuries? Where does he learn to strangle with such precision? One wrong word, one flicker of hesitation. Volkov could feel the trap closing, could feel the weight of evidence and suspicion and political necessity pressing down on him like the earth above a grave. But he had survived the siege of Stalingrad. He had crawled through minefields and crossed frozen rivers and killed men in ways that would haunt him until his last breath. He would survive this too. It's a long story, Comrade Major, Volkov said, meeting those ice-chip eyes with manufactured calm. It begins in Siberia, in a village so small it doesn't appear on most maps. It begins with my grandfather, and a secret that has been passed down through 4 generations of the Volkov family. A secret that won this war, one life at a time. Korsakov nodded slowly. Then you'd better start talking, Captain. We have all night. And so Dmitry Volkov began to speak, began to unspool the thread of his life, knowing that with each word he was either weaving his salvation or his shroud. The legend was about to be told, but whether it would be written as testimony or confession remained to be seen. The village of Kolodny Kliuch existed in that vast, indifferent expanse of Siberia where winter lasted 9 months and summer was merely a rumor. Dmitry Volkov was born there in 1915, the year the Tsar's armies were bleeding themselves white on the Eastern Front, the year before the world would crack open and spill revolution across the Russian steppe. His first memories were of cold, the kind that crept through log walls and beneath wool blankets, that made the air itself seem brittle and sharp. His father, Pyotr, worked the timber camps. His mother, Anya, died of typhus before Dmitry's 5th birthday, leaving behind only the faint smell of pine soap and a lullaby that Dmitry would forget within a year. But it was his grandfather, old Konstantin Volkov, who shaped him. Konstantin was a relic of another age. He had served in the Russo-Japanese War, had survived the trenches at Mukden, and carried with him the philosophies and fighting techniques of a dying warrior culture. The old man was lean as jerky, with hands like oak roots and eyes that held secrets. He never spoke of the revolution, never praised or condemned the Bolsheviks. He existed outside politics, outside ideology, a ghost from the imperial past who refused to fade. Dmitry was small for his age, weak from childhood illnesses and a diet that consisted mainly of black bread and watery cabbage soup. The other village boys mocked him relentlessly. Little Crow, they called him, because he was thin and dark-haired and seemed always to be watching from the edges of things. At 8 years old, he came home with a split lip and a blackened eye, delivered by Ivan Gromov, the blacksmith's son, who had 3 years and 20 kilograms on him. Konstantin took one look at his grandson and said, "Come." He led Dmitry into the small shed behind their house, where he kept his tools and his memories. From a locked wooden chest, the old man produced a length of silk cord, deep crimson in color, with tassels at each end worked in gold thread. It was beautiful and anachronistic and strangely hypnotic. "This," Konstantin said, "is a shkolnik, a strangling cord. It is older than you, older than your father, older than the Tsar. It came to us from the Ottoman Wars, taken from a Janissary assassin who tried to kill a Russian general in his tent. That general was my great-grandfather. He killed the assassin, took this weapon, and passed it down through our family with a single instruction: learn its language." Young Dmitry touched the silk reverently. It was soft, impossibly smooth, yet when he pulled it taut between his hands, it became hard as steel cable. "Why are you showing me this, grandfather?" "Because you are weak," Konstantin said bluntly. "And the world does not forgive weakness. But strength comes in many forms. A bear has strength in its paws. A wolf has strength in its pack. You, Dmitryushka, will have strength in patience, in precision, in the ability to end a life before your enemy even knows you are an enemy." That winter, while other boys learned to hunt and chop wood, Konstantin taught Dmitry the ancient art of silent killing. Not with knives or guns, but with hands and cord and pressure points mapped out on the human body like cities on a chart. The training was brutal. Konstantin would attack without warning while Dmitri ate, while he slept, while he carried water from the well. The boy learned to move like smoke, to read body language, to identify the precise moment when an opponent's guard dropped. But the cord, the shkolnik, that was the centerpiece of his education. Konstantin taught him how to hold it, never around the knuckles, always with full hand grip for maximum control. How to loop it, a single motion, fluid as water. How to position his body, low center of gravity. Knees bent, weight forward. And most importantly, how to apply pressure steady, unrelenting, positioned precisely on the carotid arteries to induce unconsciousness in 7 seconds, death in 30. "A gun announces your presence," Konstantin would rasp during their twilight training sessions. "A knife leaves evidence. But a cord? A cord is the whisper of death. It is intimate. It requires you to look into your enemy's eyes, to feel their last breath against your face. This is not a weapon for cowards. This is the weapon of a man who understands the terrible weight of taking a life." Dmitri practiced on fence posts wrapped in burlap, on scarecrows stuffed with straw, on the carcasses of deer and elk that hunters brought back from the taiga. His hands developed calluses in strange places. His forearms grew dense with muscle. By his 12th birthday, he could strangle a practiced dummy in absolute silence, could approach from any angle, could complete the kill in the time it took to draw a breath. But more importantly, he learned patience. The cord was not a weapon of passion or rage, it was a weapon of calculation. You studied your target. You waited for the perfect moment. You moved with absolute commitment. You did not hesitate. You did not feel. You simply executed the technique, and the technique was flawless. And when it was over, you walked away as silently as you had arrived. The bullying stopped around his 14th birthday, though not because Dmitri had grown or suddenly become strong. It stopped because Ivan Gromov, the blacksmith's son, picked a fight with him behind the schoolhouse and woke up minutes later with a splitting headache and no memory of what had happened. The doctor said it was a fainting spell. The other boys knew better. They could see it in Dmitri's eyes, the cold certainty of someone who had stared into the abyss and learned its secrets. Konstantin died in the winter of 1931, freezing to death one night when he went out to check his traps and never returned. They found him 3 days later, sitting against a birch tree, his eyes still open, his expression peaceful. In his coat pocket was a note for Dmitri. "The cord is yours now. Use it only when all other options have failed. Use it to protect the weak and punish the wicked. And when your time comes, pass it on with honor." Dmitri kept the shkolnik wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in the bottom of his rucksack. When war came in 1941, when Hitler's armies poured across the border like a steel flood, Dmitri volunteered immediately. He was 26 years old, still slight of build, with a face that people forgot moments after meeting him. The recruitment officer almost rejected him. But they needed bodies, and bodies were in short supply. Private Dmitri Volkov entered the Red Army, carrying standard-issue equipment, a Mosin Nagant rifle, a shovel, a mess kit, and a length of crimson silk cord that weighed less than 100 grams, but carried the accumulated weight of 4 generations of killers. No one knew about it. No one asked. In a war where millions would die, one antique strangling cord seemed laughably irrelevant. They would learn otherwise. By October 1943, the strategic landscape of the Eastern Front had shifted dramatically. The Wehrmacht, once seemingly invincible, was now in fighting retreat. Stalingrad had broken the back of the Sixth Army. Kursk had devoured Germany's last hope for offensive initiative. Now, as autumn rains transformed Ukraine into an ocean of mud, Soviet forces pressed westward in a series of grinding, bloody offensives designed to reclaim territory mile by agonizing mile. But retreat did not mean defeat, not yet. The German Wehrmacht, for all its losses, remained a professional, disciplined, and lethally effective fighting force. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Poltava region, where General Erich von Manstein's Army Group South had established a series of defensive lines that turned each village, each river crossing, each hill, into a miniature fortress. Captain Dmitri Volkov promoted twice for actions he never spoke about, served with the 180th Rifle Division, 3rd Ukrainian Front, under the overall command of General Rodion Malinovsky. His unit had been fighting continuously since September, advancing through a landscape that seemed designed by a malevolent god. Endless flat steppe broken by sudden ravines, thick forests that hid German machine gun nests, rivers swollen with autumn rain that ran red with blood. The weather was misery incarnate. October in Ukraine meant cold rain that fell in gray curtains, turning roads into rivers of glutinous mud that could swallow a truck up to its axles. Visibility dropped to 100 meters on good days, 50 on bad. The temperature hovered just above freezing, too warm for snow, too cold for comfort. Soldiers lived in a perpetual state of damp chill, their uniforms never truly dry, their feet rotting inside their boots from trench foot and frostbite. The terrain around Poltava was deceptively open, rolling agricultural land, dotted with collective farm buildings and small woodlots, stretched to the horizon in all directions. But this openness was an illusion. German engineers had transformed the landscape into a killing ground. Every tree line concealed a reinforced position. Every farm building had been fortified with concrete and steel. Every road was registered by German artillery, coordinates calculated to the meter, ready to rain high-explosive death on any Soviet unit that dared to advance. And at the center of this defensive web sat the 44th Infantry Division, commanded by Colonel Ernst Hoffmann. Hoffmann was not one of the aristocratic Prussian officers that populated the Wehrmacht's upper echelons. He was a career soldier from Munich, the son of a brewery owner who had joined the army in 1919 and had spent 2 decades learning the craft of war. He was 53 years old, methodical, pitiless, and extraordinarily competent. Under his command, the 44th had earned a reputation as one of the most effective defensive units on the Eastern Front. His strategy was elegantly simple: defense in depth, coordinated artillery, and mobile counterattacks. The 44th occupied a series of fortified villages arranged in a triangular pattern, each supporting the others with interlocking fields of fire. German observers in church steeples and grain silos called down artillery strikes with devastating accuracy. Stuka dive bombers appeared whenever the clouds lifted, screaming down to deliver bombs and machine gun fire. And when Soviet forces finally broke through the first line of defense, they would find themselves caught in pre-registered kill zones, cut down by artillery and machine guns firing from prepared positions. The 180th Rifle Division had already lost nearly 40% of its effective strength trying to crack this defensive line. Companies that had begun the offensive with 120 men now fielded 60. Veteran platoon leaders were dead, replaced by terrified lieutenants fresh from training academies. Equipment was wearing out. Ammunition was rationed. Morale was beginning to crack. Captain Volkov's reconnaissance company had been tasked with infiltrating German lines, gathering intelligence on strong points, and conducting sabotage operations. It was brutal, dangerous work. Of the 30 men who had started with him in September, only 14 remained. The rest were dead, captured, or had simply disappeared into the Ukrainian mud. But the breaking point came on October 15th. 2nd Battalion, 180th Rifle Division, launched what was supposed to be a coordinated assault on the village of Novaya Vodolaga, a key position in Hoffmann's defensive line. The attack began at dawn with a 15-minute artillery barrage that should have suppressed German defenses. It didn't. The moment Soviet infantry rose from their trenches and began advancing across the open ground, German machine guns opened up. Volkov watched from an observation post 300 meters away, helpless. The killing was industrial in its efficiency. Soviet soldiers fell in windows, cut down before they could cover 50 meters. Those who made it to the German wire found themselves tangled in minefields that the pre-assault reconnaissance had somehow missed. Survivors crawled back through mud and blood, leaving nearly 200 bodies sprawled across the killing ground. But the worst was yet to come. At 1,400 hours, German artillery opened up on the Soviet staging areas, a concentrated bombardment that suggested perfect intelligence about troop positions. Katyusha, rocket launchers, ammunition dumps, field hospitals, all were hit with precise, devastating fire. The bombardment lasted 30 minutes, and killed more than 400 men. That night, as stretcher-bearers collected the wounded and burial details dug mass graves, the truth emerged. The Germans had known the attack was coming. They had known the exact time, the exact location, the exact assault plan. There was a leak. Someone, a collaborator, a prisoner who had talked, perhaps even a Soviet officer, was feeding information to Hoffman's intelligence section. Division command went into crisis mode. Orders came down from front headquarters. Hoffman had to be eliminated. Not captured, eliminated. His tactical genius had cost too many lives. More importantly, his death would throw the 44th Division into chaos, create an opening for a breakthrough offensive that could unhinge the entire German defensive line. But how do you kill a man who never leaves his fortified headquarters, who is surrounded by security, who has survived 2 assassination attempts already? The answer came from an unlikely source: partisan intelligence. A contact in Poltava, a former schoolteacher named Yevgenia, who ran a network of informants among the civilian population, reported that Hoffman would be attending a cultural evening at an occupied manor house on October 17th. It was a propaganda event designed to demonstrate German civility to the local Ukrainian population. Music, champagne, speeches about German-Ukrainian cooperation in the crusade against Bolshevism. The manor house belonged to a collaborationist local official who had thrown in his lot with the occupation. More importantly, Yevgenia had an asset inside the event, a young woman named Nadia, who would be working as serving staff. She could smuggle someone inside, someone small, someone forgettable, someone who could blend into the background, move through the party unnoticed, and get close to Hoffman. When the mission parameters were presented at the emergency staff meeting, every officer in the room knew what it meant. This wasn't reconnaissance. This wasn't sabotage. This was assassination, and the assassin would almost certainly die in the attempt. Division Commander Colonel Petrov looked around the room, his eyes finally settling on Captain Volkov. "You're the best infiltration specialist we have, and you're the right size to pass as a servant." He paused. "This is entirely voluntary. If you refuse, there will be no mark on your record." Volkov thought of his grandfather, of the crimson cord wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his rucksack, of a promise made beside a frozen corpse in a Siberian winter. Use it only when all other options have failed. Use it to protect the weak and punish the wicked. All other options had failed, and Hoffman was as wicked as they came. "I'll do it," Volkov said quietly. The room erupted in a chaos of planning timelines, extraction routes, contingencies, but Volkov barely heard any of it. He was already thinking about the manor house, about champagne and music, and a man who had sent thousands to their deaths with a stroke of his pen. Ernst Hoffman had 36 hours left to live, though he didn't know it yet. The partisan safehouse stank of cabbage and desperation. Located in the cellar of a bombed-out pharmacy on the outskirts of Poltava, it housed a rotating cast of resistance fighters, Soviet intelligence operatives, and local civilians who had chosen the dangerous path of collaboration with the Red Army. When Captain Volkov arrived on the evening of October 16th, accompanied by Lieutenant Grishin and Sergeant Borodin, he found Yevgenia waiting with the grim expression of someone who had sent too many people to their deaths. She was perhaps 45, though the war had aged her gray streaks in her dark hair, lines carved deep around her mouth and eyes. Before the occupation, she had taught literature at the local gymnasium. Now she coordinated intelligence networks, forged documents, and arranged assassinations with the cold efficiency of a bureaucrat processing requisition forms. "You're smaller than I expected," she said, sizing up Volkov with a clinical eye. "That's good. Ernst Hoffman likes his servants invisible." Nadia stood beside her, a girl of 19 or 20, pretty in a faded way, with blonde hair and blue eyes that had seen too much. She wore a maid's uniform, black dress and white apron, the costume of servitude that would be Volkov's disguise. "The layout," Yevgenia said, unrolling a hand-drawn floor plan on the scarred wooden table. "The Melnik Manor, built in 1887, 2 stories, ballroom on the ground floor, private offices and quarters above. The event begins at 1,900 hours. Approximately 60 guests, German officers, local collaborators, Ukrainian police. Security is heavy but not paranoid. They're drinking, celebrating, convinced they're safe behind their lines. She tapped a spot on the second floor. Hoffman will use this room, the library, as his private office during the event. He always does. He drinks sparingly, stays maybe 90 minutes, then retreats upstairs to work. He's obsessive. Even at a party, he's reviewing intelligence reports, planning deployments. "How do I get inside?" Volkov asked. Nadia spoke for the first time, her voice soft but steady. "You'll come with me. I'm part of the serving staff, 6 of us. Locals hired for the event. I told the head butler we needed an extra man to handle the wine cellar. He didn't question it. They're short-staffed, since most of the men have been conscripted. And once I'm inside, you serve wine. You keep your head down. You wait," Yevgenia said. "When Hoffman goes upstairs, you follow. Nadia will create a distraction, break a tray, spill something. Security will focus on her for 10, maybe 15 seconds. That's your window." Volkov studied the floor plan, memorizing stairs, doorways, windows. "Exit strategy? There is none," Yevgenia said flatly. "Once you kill him, the manor will be locked down. Your best chance is to hide, wait for the chaos. Try to slip out during the evacuation. But realistically," she met his eyes, "this is a one-way mission, Captain. I won't lie to you." The words hung in the cold air. Lieutenant Grecian shifted uncomfortably. Sergeant Borodin, a grizzled veteran who had survived Stalingrad, spat on the floor. "Fuck the Germans," he muttered. "Do it for the boys we buried yesterday." The next 18 hours were a strange limbo. Volkov slept fitfully on a pile of musty blankets, his dreams populated by ghosts, his grandfather, his dead comrades, the faces of men he'd killed. He woke before dawn and spent an hour in meditation, a technique Constantine had taught him. Clear the mind, focus on the breath, become empty, become ready. At 1,400 hours, Yevgenia brought the servant's uniform, black trousers, white shirt, black vest, white gloves. It fit reasonably well, though the shoulders were slightly loose. Volkov stood before a cracked mirror, barely recognizing himself. His face, normally sharp and angular, seemed to blur into ordinariness. He practiced expressions servile, invisible, beneath notice. From his rucksack, he retrieved the shkolnik. The crimson silk seemed to glow in the dim cellar light. He wound it carefully around his waist, beneath the shirt, the cord warm against his skin. It weighed almost nothing, yet he could feel its presence, like a second heartbeat. "No weapons?" Nadia asked, watching him prepare. "Just this," Volkov said, touching his waist. "It's all I need." At 1,730 hours, they left the safe house. Poltava, under occupation, was a city of contradictions. Ukrainian civilians going about their daily lives under the watchful eyes of German soldiers, propaganda posters proclaiming liberation from Bolshevik oppression plastered beside buildings still bearing the scars of Soviet artillery. Volkov and Nadia moved through streets slick with rain, heads down, part of the gray flow of occupation life. The Melnik Manor sat on a low hill outside the city center, surrounded by trees that had somehow survived the fighting. It was an elegant piece of pre-revolutionary architecture, white columns, wide windows, a porte-cochere where staff cars were already arriving. Light spilled from the windows. Music drifted out, a string quartet playing something German and formal. It looked like a scene from peacetime, from a world where men didn't die screaming in muddy fields. Volkov felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the point of no return. Nadia led him to the service entrance, where a harassed-looking German sergeant checked their papers, forged documents, identifying them as local workers. The sergeant barely glanced at them, waving them through with a grunt. Inside, the kitchen was chaos. Cooks shouting orders, waiters balancing trays, the smell of roasting meat and baking bread, luxuries that Soviet soldiers hadn't seen in months. The head butler, a severe Ukrainian man named Kostiantin, assigned Volkov to wine service. "You speak German?" he demanded. "Enough," Volkov lied. "Then keep your mouth shut, pour the wine, and don't embarrass me. The Wehrmacht expects professionalism." For the next 90 minutes, Volkov moved through the party like a ghost. He poured wine, cleared glasses, kept his eyes down. German officers laughed and drank, and discussed the war with the casual arrogance of men who believed they were winning. Ukrainian collaborators clustered in nervous groups, trying too hard to fit in, and everywhere the symbols of occupation swastika flags, portraits of Hitler, German efficiency, made manifest. He spotted Hoffman at 1,930 hours. The colonel stood near the ballroom's center, surrounded by subordinates, a glass of mineral water in his hand. He was tall, gray-haired, with a face like a hawk, sharp nose, cold eyes, thin-lipped mouth. He wore his uniform with perfect precision, every crease sharp, every medal positioned exactly. When he spoke, men leaned in to listen. When he laughed, a rare, brief sound, others laughed with him. Volkov studied him with the cold focus of a hunter. Hoffman moved like a man, in complete control. No nervous gestures, no wasted motion. Even in a social setting, he radiated authority. This was not going to be easy. At 2,045 hours, exactly as Yevgenia had predicted, Hoffman excused himself and headed for the stairs. Volkov watched him go, then caught Nadia's eye across the room. She nodded once. He began moving toward the stairs, heart hammering. A German captain called out for more wine, and Volkov poured with steady hands, then continued. 15 meters to the stairs, 10, 5. Behind him, a tremendous crash. Nadia had, accidentally, dropped an entire tray of champagne glasses. The sound was explosive in the ballroom's acoustics. Every head turned. Security guards moved toward her, shouting questions. Volkov slipped up the stairs like smoke. The second floor was quiet, insulated from the party below. Thick carpets swallowed sound. Gas lamps cast pools of amber light. Volkov moved down the corridor, counting doors, his hand moving to his waist where the cord waited beneath his shirt. Ahead, light spilled from an open doorway, the library. He could hear movement inside, the rustle of papers, the creak of a chair. Hoffman was alone, reviewing documents just as Yevgenia had predicted. Volkov paused outside the door, forcing himself to breathe slowly, deeply. This was the moment. Everything, his training, his grandfather's teaching, the weight of 4 generations, had led to this corridor, this door, this heartbeat. He unwound the shkolnik from his waist, the crimson silk sliding through his fingers. His hands remembered the grip, automatically full palm, thumbs inside the loop, ready for the swift upward motion that would lock the cord around the throat. 7 seconds to unconsciousness. 30 to death. Volkov stepped into the library. Colonel Ernst Hoffman looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from surprise to confusion to alarm in the space of a breath. His hand moved toward the pistol on his belt, but he was sitting, and Volkov was already moving, covering the distance in 3 swift strides. "What?" Hoffman began. Volkov was behind him. The cord whipped around the colonel's throat in a single fluid motion, the silk settling into place with terrible precision. Hoffman's hands flew up instinctively, fingers clawing at his neck, but the cord was already tight, already cutting off blood flow to the brain. "For the 400 men you killed on October 15th, Volkov whispered in Russian, though he knew Hoffman couldn't understand him. "For every Soviet soldier who died because of your tactics," Hoffman thrashed, his chair tipping backward. They went down together, Volkov maintaining the grip with perfect technique, legs wrapped around the colonel's torso, back arched, every muscle locked. Hoffman was strong, fighting with the desperation of a man drowning, but physics and anatomy were on Volkov's side. The carotid arteries were compressed. The brain was starving for oxygen. 7 seconds passed. Hoffman's struggles began to weaken. His hands stopped clawing, began to fall. His breathing harsh, rasping grew shallow. 15 seconds. His body went slack, unconscious. But Volkov didn't let go. 30 seconds would ensure death. He counted each heartbeat, felt Hoffman's pulse fade against his wrists, felt the warmth of another man's life draining away. At 30 seconds, he released the cord. Colonel Ernst Hoffman slumped forward, eyes open but unseeing, a thread of saliva connecting his lips to the Persian rug beneath him. The architect of the Poltava defense was dead. Volkov stood, rewinding the cord around his waist with trembling hands. The library was silent except for the distant sound of music from below, a waltz, light and innocent. He looked down at the body, feeling nothing. No triumph, no remorse. Just emptiness. Outside, voices in the corridor, guards making their rounds. Volkov moved to the window, but it looked out onto the front courtyard, where German vehicles were parked. No escape that way. He checked the room. A closet, a bookshelf, a writing desk. No good hiding places. The voices grew louder. A guard spoke in German. "The colonel has been up there a while. We should check." Footsteps approaching. 2 men, maybe 3. Volkov pressed himself against the wall beside the door, the cord back in his hands. If they came in, he would kill them too. And then more guards would come. And eventually, inevitably, he would be overwhelmed and killed. Yevgenia had been right. This was a one-way mission. The door swung open. A German sergeant stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding Hoffman's body. "Scheisse!" he shouted. "The colonel!" Volkov moved. The German sergeant never finished his warning. Volkov's cord whipped around his throat mid-shout, transforming the word colonel into a strangled gasp that died in his windpipe. The man was younger, faster than Hoffman, and he spun violently, trying to throw Volkov off. But the cord was already locked, already killing. 7 seconds. The sergeant's hands found Volkov's wrists, pulling with desperate strength. But the angle was wrong. The leverage was wrong. His fingers clawed bloody furrows in Volkov's skin. It didn't matter. 5 seconds. The sergeant's face was turning purple, eyes bulging, veins standing out like cables beneath his skin. 3 seconds. His knees buckled. Volkov rode him down to the carpet, never loosening the grip, never showing mercy. The sergeant went limp just as the second guard appeared in the doorway, an older corporal with a weathered face and reflexes honed by 4 years of war. He didn't shout. He drew his Luger with practiced speed, the muzzle tracking toward Volkov's chest. Time seemed to crystallize. Volkov could see the corporal's finger tightening on the trigger, could see the cold certainty in his eyes. A bullet at this range would punch through ribs, shred lungs, end the mission, end everything. Volkov released the dead sergeant and dove sideways as the Luger barked. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, the bullet taking a chunk out of the writing desk, where Volkov's head had been a fraction of a second earlier. He rolled behind a leather armchair as the corporal fired again, the round punching through the chair's back and missing Volkov by centimeters. The corporal was advancing, weapon raised, professional and controlled. "Drop the cord," he ordered in accented Russian, evidently recognizing Volkov as Soviet. "Hands where I can see them." Volkov didn't respond. He was calculating distances, angles, possibilities. The corporal was 3 meters away, too far for the cord, and Volkov had no other weapons. The chair provided minimal cover. In another second, the corporal would have a clean shot, and this time he wouldn't miss. But Konstantin's voice echoed from across the years. "A weapon is anything you can use to turn your enemy's strength against him. Improvise, adapt, survive." Volkov's hand found the heavy crystal ashtray on the side table beside the chair. Without thinking, operating on pure instinct and training, he hurled it at the corporal's face. The German flinched, raised his free hand to block, and in that half-second of distraction, Volkov exploded from behind the chair. The corporal tried to bring the Luger back on target, but Volkov was inside his guard, one hand deflecting the weapon while the other drove fingers into the soft tissue beneath the corporal's jaw. It was a pressure point strike Konstantin had taught him, not lethal, but incapacitating. The corporal's eyes rolled back and he staggered, the Luger slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers. Volkov caught the pistol mid-fall, reversed his grip, and brought the heavy metal grip down on the corporal's temple with brutal efficiency. The German dropped without a sound. The entire engagement had lasted perhaps 10 seconds. 3 men down. Volkov stood in the center of the library, breathing hard, the Luger steady in his hand. Blood roared in his ears. Adrenaline sang through his nervous system. He had crossed a threshold. This was no longer assassination. This was war. Downstairs, the music had stopped. Voices were shouting in German, the gunshots had been heard. Boots on hardwood floors. orders being barked. The entire manor was mobilizing. Volkov moved to the door, looked down the corridor. Empty, but that wouldn't last. He could hear soldiers organizing, sweeping the second floor room by room, maybe 20 seconds before they reached the library. No time to hide the bodies. No time for anything except what came next. He checked the Luger. 7 rounds remaining in the magazine, against potentially 40 or 50 German soldiers and security personnel. This is a good place to die, he thought distantly. As good as any. But something in him, the stubborn Siberian soul that had survived Volkov winters, Stalin's purges, the siege of Stalingrad, refused to surrender. If he was going to die, he would die fighting. He would take as many of them with him as he could. He would make them pay for every meter of ground. For every Soviet soldier who died in the mud outside Novaya Vodolaga. For every life Hoffman had spent like loose change. The Shkolnik was still wound around his waist. Volkov rewound it tighter, feeling the silk warm against his skin. A gun in one hand, a strangling cord at his belt, and 40 Germans between him and freedom. The mathematics were impossible. The odds were laughable. But mathematics and odds had never stopped the Red Army before. Volkov stepped into the corridor. The second-floor corridor of the Melnik Manor stretched before him like a gauntlet, 20 meters of ornate wallpaper, antique side tables, and crystal sconces that cast dancing shadows. At the far end, a staircase descended to the ground floor, where he could hear German voices organizing, commands being shouted in clipped, efficient tones. They were coming. Volkov moved along the wall, the Luger held in a two-handed grip, every sense heightened to preternatural clarity. He could smell the cordite from the earlier shots, could taste copper and fear in his mouth, could hear his own heartbeat like a drum announcing his presence. The first German soldiers appeared at the top of the stairs, 3 of them, Wehrmacht infantry with Kar 9, 8K rifles raised. They spotted him immediately. No hesitation. They opened fire. Volkov threw himself sideways into an alcove as bullets shredded wallpaper and splintered wood. The alcove housed a marble bust of some forgotten Russian noble. It exploded into powder as a round struck it dead center. Volkov extended the Luger around the corner, fired twice blind, heard a shout of pain. 1 down, or at least wounded. But more were coming. He could hear boots thundering up the stairs, officers shouting orders. They were going to flank him, box him in, overwhelm him with sheer numbers. He needed to move, to create chaos, to keep them off balance. Volkov burst from the alcove, firing as he ran. 2 shots, the first caught a soldier in the chest, spinning him backward into his comrades. The second went wide, punching a hole in an oil painting of a pastoral scene. He reached a doorway, a bedroom, and dove inside, slamming the door behind him and throwing the lock. The door wouldn't hold them for long. Already he could hear them gathering outside, preparing to breach. Volkov scanned the room. 4-poster bed, wardrobe, window overlooking the side courtyard. He moved to the window, looked down. 3-meter drop to a gravel path. Survivable. But German soldiers were already taking up positions below, rifles trained upward. Surrounded, he muttered to himself in Russian. Good. It was something Sergeant Borodin used to say during the worst of the Stalingrad fighting. When you're surrounded, the enemy is in range in every direction. Dark humor from men who had learned to laugh at death? Volkov grabbed the heavy wooden chair from the vanity and hurled it through the window. Glass exploded outward in a glittering cascade. The Germans below flinched, instinctively bringing their rifles to bear on the window. That fraction of a second was all Volkov needed. He appeared in the shattered frame, Luger barking 3 times in rapid succession. 2 soldiers dropped, the third dove for cover. Behind him, the bedroom door splintered as German soldiers began kicking it in. The lock wouldn't hold for more than a few seconds. Volkov turned from the window, dropped the Luger's empty magazine, and slapped in a fresh one he'd taken from the dead corporal. Full magazine, 8 rounds. He moved to the side of the door, pressing his back to the wall, and unwound the Shkolnik from his waist. The door exploded inward. A German sergeant came through fast and low, MP-40 submachine gun raised. But Volkov wasn't where he expected. The sergeant's momentum carried him forward, into the room, and Volkov was behind him in an instant. The cord whipped around the sergeant's throat from behind, the silk settling with the precision of a surgical instrument. The sergeant's finger tightened on the MP40's trigger in a death spasm, spraying bullets across the bedroom in a wild arc that shredded the mattress and shattered the mirror. Then he was unconscious, then dead, and Volkov lowered him to the floor with almost gentle care. 2 more soldiers rushed through the door. Volkov met the first with the Luger. 2 shots, center mass, at point-blank range. The man's momentum carried him forward, and Volkov used the body as a shield, shoving it toward the second soldier. They collided and went down in a tangle of limbs. Volkov was on the second man before he could recover, the cord flashing in the lamplight, and then there was only the wet, desperate sound of a man dying in silence. But the cost was mounting. Volkov could feel it in his muscles, in the trembling in his hands, in the way his breath came in ragged gasps. He'd been fighting for what felt like hours, but had probably been less than 5 minutes. The Luger was down to 5 rounds. The Germans were regrouping, getting organized. Soon they would stop trying to take him room by room and would simply saturate the space with automatic weapons fire. He needed to get out of this room, needed to keep moving. Volkov grabbed the dead sergeant's MP40 and spare magazines, slinging the weapon across his back. He moved to the door, checked the corridor. More German soldiers were advancing, but cautiously now, aware they were dealing with something deadlier than a trapped rat. "I'm Schlafzimmer," one shouted. In the bedroom. They were preparing to storm the room en masse. Volkov stepped into the corridor, MP40 raised, and opened fire. The weapon roared in his hands, spitting bullets in controlled bursts. German soldiers dove for cover, returned fire, the corridor becoming a storm of noise and smoke. Volkov ducked back into the bedroom as return fire chewed chunks from the doorframe. He was bleeding now, a graze across his left forearm where a bullet had kissed him, another crease along his ribs. Nothing fatal, but he could feel warmth soaking through his shirt. The servant's disguise was ruined, soaked with blood and sweat and cordite residue. "This is it," he thought with strange clarity. "This is where I die." But before that happened, he would make them remember his name. Volkov grabbed one of the dead soldier's stick grenades from his belt, pulled the cord, counted 3 seconds, and hurled it into the corridor. The explosion was devastating in the enclosed space. Shrapnel and pressure wave and screaming chaos. He followed immediately, moving through the smoke like a demon, the MP40 chattering in short, controlled bursts. He caught a glimpse of Nadia at the far end of the corridor. She had somehow made it upstairs, her face pale and terrified. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Volkov shook his head once, sharply. "Get out. Save yourself." Then he was moving again, a German officer rising from cover to his left. The Shkolnik flashed, the cord catching the officer around the throat from the side. Volkov spun, using the officer's body as a pivot point, throwing the man into 2 more soldiers who were trying to bring their rifles to bear. They went down in a confused heap, and Volkov dropped the MP40, drew his last grenade, and tossed it into the pile of bodies. He didn't wait to see the result. He ran for the main staircase, vaulting over debris and bodies, his lungs burning, his vision starting to narrow from blood loss and exhaustion. German soldiers were everywhere now, behind him, below him, flanking from side corridors. Bullets chased him, splinters and stone fragments exploding around his head. Halfway down the stairs, a German lieutenant appeared directly in his path, pistol raised. They fired simultaneously. The lieutenant's shot went wide, panic or poor aim. Volkov's did not. The lieutenant tumbled backward, and Volkov leaped over his body, landing in the grand foyer. The foyer was chaos. Ukrainian servants cowering in corners, German officers shouting orders, and in the center of it all, Captain Dmitry Volkov, surrounded, bleeding, weaponless, except for a length of crimson silk cord. "Halt!" An officer commanded in German. "Surrender or we shoot." Volkov looked around the room. 20 German soldiers, all with weapons trained on him. No way out, no miracles left. He was done. He raised his hands slowly, the Shkolnik dangling from his right hand, dark with other men's blood. "Ja, ne sdeus," he said quietly in Russian. "I do not surrender." The German officer frowned, not understanding the words. He gestured with his pistol. "Drop the weapon." Volkov began to wind the cord around his hand, movements slow and deliberate, almost ritualistic. The Germans watched, confused, not sure if this was surrender or preparation for a final attack. Then the windows exploded inward. Soviet submachine gun fire raked the foyer. Partisan fighters, probably alerted by Nadia, attacking from outside. Germans scattered, returning fire, the foyer transforming into a three-way firefight between Wehrmacht soldiers, Soviet partisans, and one exhausted, bleeding captain who stood in the eye of the storm with a silk cord in his hands and death in his eyes. Volkov moved through the chaos like a ghost. He killed the German officer with the cord, the man's shout of alarm cut off mid-syllable. He grabbed a fallen rifle, used it to shoot two soldiers who had their backs turned, fighting the partisans outside. He kicked over a table, used it as cover, reloaded the rifle with magazines stripped from the dead. The fighting was primal now, hand to hand in places, the line between friend and enemy blurred by smoke and darkness, and the fundamental confusion of close-quarters combat. Volkov killed without thinking, moving on pure instinct and training, the Shkolnik and his stolen weapons extensions of his will. A German sergeant came at him with a bayonet. Volkov sidestepped, the cord settling around the man's wrist and yanking hard, hyperextending the elbow with an audible crack. The bayonet fell. Volkov caught it, reversed it, drove it up under the sergeant's jaw in one smooth motion. Another soldier, young, perhaps 18, eyes wide with terror. Volkov hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, saw his own mortality reflected in that young face. The hesitation almost killed him. The young soldier raised his rifle. Volkov dove sideways, the shot going wide, and then he was on the soldier, the cord around his throat, and the boy died just like all the others, with the same desperate gasps and the same terrible finality. Sometime later, minutes or hours, Volkov couldn't tell, the shooting stopped. The foyer was a slaughterhouse. Bodies everywhere, German and partisan and civilian. The chandeliers were shattered, the walls pocked with bullet holes, the expensive Persian rugs soaked with blood. Volkov stood in the center of it all, swaying slightly, the Shkolnik wound around his right hand, his left gripping a captured pistol. Partisan fighters moved through the carnage, checking bodies, securing the building. One of them, a grizzled man with an eye patch, approached Volkov carefully. "Captain Volkov?" he asked in Ukrainian-accented Russian. Volkov nodded, not trusting his voice. "Yevgenia sent us when she heard the shooting. We were staging nearby for another operation." The partisan looked around the destroyed foyer, at the 20-plus German bodies, and shook his head in disbelief. "Did you do this? All of this?" "Hoffman," Volkov rasped. "Is he dead?" "Very dead. We found him upstairs, strangled, along with 5 other Germans." The partisan paused. "How many did you kill?" Volkov thought about it. The library, the bedroom, the corridor, the stairs, the foyer. He had lost count somewhere in the middle, his mind recording only shapes and movements and the wet sounds of death. "Enough," he finally said. The partisan laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. "Enough? Comrade, you've killed more Germans tonight than some entire companies manage in a month. You're either a hero or a madman." "Can't I be both?" Volkov asked, and then his legs gave out, and he sat down hard on the blood-slicked marble floor. They got him out through the servants' entrance, moving quickly through the darkness before German reinforcements could arrive. Behind them, the Melnik Manor burned. The partisans had set fires to cover their retreat and destroy evidence. Volkov watched the flames from the back of a truck. The Shkolnik cleaned and wound around his waist once more, his wounds bandaged with torn strips of bedsheet. He had accomplished his mission. Colonel Ernst Hoffmann was dead, along with a significant portion of his staff. The 44th Infantry Division's command structure was decapitated, and Soviet forces would exploit the chaos within 48 hours, breaking through the defensive line and beginning the long advance toward Poland. But as Volkov sat in that truck, being driven through the Ukrainian darkness toward Soviet lines, he felt no triumph, only exhaustion, and the weight of too many deaths. adding to a burden he had been carrying since that Siberian winter when his grandfather had first placed a silk cord in his hands. Behind him, the manor continued to burn, a funeral pyre for 40 men who had underestimated the small, quiet Soviet captain with the crimson cord. They would not make that mistake again. The partisan truck delivered Captain Volkov to a field hospital 15 kilometers behind Soviet lines just before dawn. He was feverish, delirious from blood loss and shock, muttering fragments of the night's violence as exhausted medics cut away his ruined clothing and worked to stabilize his wounds. The bullet graze on his arm required stitches. The one along his ribs had cracked bone but missed anything vital. His hands were shredded from the cord's silk-abrading skin during the final desperate fights. But he would live. That was the doctor's verdict, delivered with the clinical detachment of a man who had made that pronouncement 1,000 times and knew how little it really meant. Volkov slept for 18 hours, dreamless and deep. When he woke, it was to find Colonel Petrov sitting beside his cot, smoking a cigarette and studying him with an expression Volkov couldn't quite read. "You're awake," Petrov said. "Good. We have much to discuss. Hoffman?" Volkov's voice was rough as gravel. "Dead. Confirmed by partisan intelligence and German radio traffic. The 44th Division has been thrown into chaos. Their interim commander is competent, but nowhere near Hoffman's caliber. We launched our breakthrough offensive 6 hours ago and have advanced nearly 15 kilometers with minimal resistance." Petrov paused. "You did what you were sent to do, Captain. You eliminated a high-value target. The mission was a complete success. Then why do you look like you're about to put me in front of a firing squad?" Volkov asked. Petrov exhaled smoke slowly. "Because you killed 43 Germans, Volkov. 43. In a single engagement. That's not assassination, that's a one-man massacre. And the Germans are screaming about war crimes, about Soviet stranglers and assassins. They're threatening reprisals against prisoners. I was defending myself. I know. I've read the partisan reports. I know you had no choice. But perception matters, especially in wartime." Petrov leaned forward. "NKVD wants to investigate. They want to know how a single Soviet officer managed such carnage. They want to examine your methods, your weapon. They want to know everything." Volkov's hand moved instinctively to his waist, where the shkolnik was no longer wrapped. "Where is it?" "Secured. Don't worry, I made sure they handled it carefully. But Volkov, you have to understand, what you did was extraordinary. The kind of extraordinary that makes people nervous. There are whispers that you might be a security risk, that someone with your skills could just as easily turn against Soviet leadership as against the Germans. That's insane." "Is it?" Petrov stubbed out his cigarette. "You killed Hoffman with your bare hands and a piece of silk. You killed 42 more soldiers in the subsequent fighting, many of them the same way. You're either the most valuable asset the Red Army possesses or the most dangerous threat. Right now, various branches of our government are arguing about which you are." Volkov closed his eyes. He had survived the manor, survived the investigation, only to be caught in the grinding machinery of Soviet bureaucracy. What happens now? That depends on several factors. The political winds, how badly the front needs your particular skills, whether someone high up decides you're useful or expendable. Petrov stood. "Rest, Captain. Heal. And for God's sake, don't do anything else remarkable until this blows over." But remarkable was apparently what Volkov did best, because within 3 days, word of the Poltava Strangler had spread through the division, then the front, then the entire Red Army. Soldiers told stories, some accurate, many wildly exaggerated, about the silent killer who had eliminated a German colonel and fought his way through an entire manor house armed only with a silk cord and captured weapons. The legend grew with each telling. Some versions had Volkov killing 100 Germans. Others had him using ancient martial arts techniques learned from mysterious monks. A few claimed he was immortal, a Soviet version of the Grim Reaper, sent by Stalin himself to harvest German souls. Lieutenant Grishin visited on the 4th day, bringing Volkov's personal effects and news from the front. "The breakthrough's holding," he reported. We've liberated 3 towns and captured nearly 500 German prisoners. More importantly, Wehrmacht units across the entire sector are pulling back. They're afraid. They think we've unleashed some kind of special forces unit that specializes in infiltration and assassination. It was just me, Volkov said tiredly. One man with a weapon nobody else knows how to use. That's not what the Germans think. We've intercepted communications warning officers about Soviet throat cutters and advising them never to be alone, to always travel with guards, to check their quarters for intruders. Grishin grinned. You've done more damage to German morale than a month of artillery barrages. Sergeant Borodin came the next day, bringing vodka and rough humor. You crazy bastard, he said affectionately, pouring them both drinks in violation of hospital rules. I knew you were good, but this is legend shit. Volkov, they're already writing songs about you in the trenches. Songs? Volkov grimaced. The Strangler of Poltava, mostly. The lyrics are terrible, but the sentiment is sound. You gave the boys something to believe in. Proof that we can hit the Germans where they feel safe. That their officers aren't untouchable. That we've got weapons they can't defend against. Borodin raised his cup. To Captain Dmitry Volkov, the man who killed a legend and became one himself. They drank. The vodka burned, going down, familiar and warming. But the most significant visit came on the 7th day, when Volkov was finally mobile enough to walk the hospital grounds. A black car pulled up, the kind of car that only carried NKVD or high-ranking political officers. Volkov's stomach tightened, but the man who emerged was neither interrogator nor commissar. General Rodion Malinovsky, commander of the 3rd Ukrainian Front, was a stocky man with a round face and keen eyes. He found Volkov sitting on a bench, watching Soviet fighters streak overhead toward German positions. Captain Volkov, Malinovsky said without preamble, sitting beside him. I've read the reports. All of them, including the ones the NKVD tried to keep from me. I know what you did at Poltava, and I know what they're calling you. I was following orders, Comrade General. You went far beyond your orders. You performed a feat that military theorists will study for decades. Malinovsky lit a cigarette, offered one to Volkov, who declined. The political officers wanted to use you as propaganda. The NKVD wanted to dissect you to understand your methods. The Germans want to capture you and put you on trial. Do you know what I want, Captain? No, sir. I want to give you a medal, promote you to major, and never send you on a mission like that again. Malinovsky turned to face him directly. Because men like you, men with your particular skills, are too valuable to waste on suicide missions. You're not a weapon, Volkov. You're a deterrent. Just knowing you exist will make German officers paranoid, will force them to divert resources to security, will create fear in their ranks. Dead, you're a martyr. Alive, you're a nightmare they can't wake up from. Volkov considered this. And the investigation? Over. I've convinced the relevant parties that you're more useful alive and operational than dead or imprisoned. You'll be assigned to divisional intelligence, conducting reconnaissance and training others in infiltration techniques. The Shkolnik will be returned to you, and your legend will grow, because we're going to make sure it does. I never wanted to be a legend, sir. None of us do. But this is war, and we use what weapons we have. Your grandfather gave you a piece of silk and a set of skills. You've proven their worth. Now we weaponize that proof. Malinovsky stood. Rest, Major Volkov. Heal. And when you're ready, report to divisional headquarters. We have work for you, quieter than Poltava, but no less important. The general left. Volkov sat alone on the bench, watching the sun set over the Ukrainian steppe, feeling the weight of his new rank and the heavier weight of the legend that would follow him for the rest of his life. In German headquarters across the lines, officers were indeed becoming paranoid. Guard details were doubled, security protocols were tightened, and in darkened rooms, German intelligence officers tried to piece together who or what the Poltava Strangler really was, never quite believing that a single Soviet captain with an antique weapon could have achieved such carnage. But the survivors knew. The ones who had seen him in the manor's corridors, who had watched him kill with impossible efficiency, who had felt the presence of something primal and terrifying stalking through the chandelier-lit halls, they knew. and they told their stories in hushed voices, creating the foundation of a legend that would outlive the war itself. Major Dmitry Volkov survived the war. He fought through Ukraine, Poland, and into Germany itself, always operating in the shadows, always carrying the crimson Shkolnik wound around his waist. He trained dozens of other soldiers in infiltration and close-quarters killing, though none ever mastered the cord the way he had. It was too personal, too intimate, required a mindset that couldn't be taught, only inherited or forged through terrible necessity. He was present when Soviet forces entered Berlin in April 1945. He did not participate in the final assault on the Reichstag. By then, he was operating far behind German lines, gathering intelligence and eliminating high-value targets that most soldiers never heard about. The work suited him: precise, surgical, conducted in silence and shadow. When the war ended, Volkov returned to a Soviet Union that didn't quite know what to do with him. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, though the citation was carefully vague about his specific achievements. The truth of Poltava remained classified for decades. Officially, Colonel Hoffman had died in a partisan attack. The 43 Germans killed in the manner were attributed to Special Forces operations. The legend was sanitized, made acceptable for public consumption. But in military circles, in the bars where veterans gathered, and in the training grounds where new generations of soldiers learned their craft, the truth persisted. The Strangler of Poltava, the man who killed with silk and shadow, the captain who had gone into a manor house armed with nothing but an antique weapon and had emerged having changed the course of a battle, perhaps even of the war itself. Volkov never married. He lived quietly in Moscow, working as a consultant for Soviet intelligence, training operatives in techniques he'd learned from his grandfather and refined in the hell of the Eastern Front. He rarely spoke about Poltava, and never about the men he'd killed. Those ghosts were his alone to carry. In 1968, 23 years after the war's end, a German journalist tracked him down. The journalist was writing a book about unusual weapons and tactics of World War II and had heard rumors about a Soviet officer who used a strangling cord. Volkov agreed to an interview, his first and last. "Do you regret it?" the journalist asked. "The killing? The violence?" Volkov was quiet for a long time. Outside his Moscow apartment, snow was falling, reminding him of Siberian winters and a grandfather who had taught him terrible secrets. Finally, he spoke. "Regret implies choice. I was a soldier. I followed orders. I eliminated a target who was responsible for thousands of Soviet deaths. I survived an impossible situation through skill and training my grandfather gave me." He paused. "But do I think about it? Do I remember their faces? The feeling of life ending beneath my hands? Every day, every single day. Was it worth it?" the journalist pressed. "That's not for me to judge. History will decide whether what I did was heroism or murder or simply the inevitable brutality of war. I was an instrument. The Shkolnik was an instrument. We did what instruments do. We performed our function." The journalist published the interview, though it was heavily censored by Soviet authorities. But fragments survived, passed from person to person, adding to the legend. Dmitry Volkov died in 1983, at the age of 68, of a heart attack in his sleep. He was buried in Moscow with full military honors. The Shkolnik was buried with him, wrapped around his waist one final time, as he had requested. 4 generations of killing, finally laid to rest. But legends never truly die. In military academies, instructors still teach the Poltava operation as an example of successful high-risk infiltration. Special Forces units study the techniques Volkov developed. And somewhere in the classified archives of Russian military intelligence, there are detailed reports of a captain who went into a German-occupied manor house with an antique weapon and emerged having accomplished the impossible. The cord was silk. The deaths were real. The legend is eternal. In the end, that's all we leave behind: stories. And the story of Captain Dmitry Volkov, the Strangler of Poltava, is one that will be told as long as soldiers gather to speak of courage and ingenuity and the terrible things men do in the name of duty. His weapon was ancient. His method was personal. His legend will outlive empires. And somewhere in the darkness between history and myth, The ghost of a small Siberian boy still practices with a crimson cord, learning the language of silence and death, preparing for a war that never truly ends. The cord remembers, Constantine once said. Even when we forget, the cord remembers every life it took, every moment of violence, every drop of blood. Treat it with respect, carry it with honor, and know that when your time comes, it will remember you too. Dmitry Volkov remembered. Until the very end, he remembered everything. And now so do we.